Hello, my name is Scott Hicks. I'm Director of the Teaching and Learning Center at UNC Pembroke. Today I'm joined by Dr. Abby Reiter and Dr. Miranda Ryder of the UNCP Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. Their presentation today comes from a recent article that they published about experiences of students of color at a predominantly white institution in North Carolina. Dr. Ryder and Dr. Ryder, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott. So yes, I'm Dr. Abby Reiter, and as Scott said, I'm a sociology professor here at UNCP, and most of my research focuses on race and racism and the various forms of racism and the various effects of racism. And I also study a lot of issues related to white privilege. Okay, yeah, hi, I'm Miranda Ryder. I'm also a professor of sociology and criminal justice here at UNCP. And most of my work also focuses on racism, but the effects of racism on health and health disparities is what I generally study. But I'm really excited to be part of this project as well. Okay, so our this particular study is called Experiences of Students of Color at a Predominantly White Institution in North Carolina. So this research was conducted at one of the universities here in North Carolina that is known for its, excuse me, social whiteness, and it's demographically very white. Okay, so we use critical race theory for our research to guide our questions and also to guide our data analysis. Critical race theory acknowledges that race is a structuring agent in societies. So race acts to structure people, structure groups, and basically put people in a social hierarchy. Race structures our interactions, our identities, institutions, hierarchies, basically everything about society is affected by race. So race works through various means and agents. So that means that people, institutions, organizations, interactions, everything about society helps to create and recreate what race is and how race affects people. Racism is endemic to societies. So that means that racism is everywhere. It's built into societies and its institutions and its interactions. Race and racism are everywhere and pervade everything in society. Racism is often difficult to spot. There's obviously overt and obvious racism, but we're seeing more and more implicit and subtle forms of racism. And because it's difficult to spot, it can be difficult to fight. And so that's the kind of racism that we're focusing mostly on in this project. And so that goes along the same lines. Racism can be implicit and unintentional. Many people don't actually mean to be racist, although the effects tend to be the same. And like I said, we use critical race theory, which is a critical theory in sociology that is critical of the status quo, and namely focusing on how race and racism structure society. But critical race theory also works to dismantle racism. And so that's the activist focus of critical race theory. Oops. Okay, so the purpose of this research, so we wanted to understand the experiences of students of color at this predominantly white university. So their everyday lived experiences, how students of color experience their college when most of the students and faculty members and staff members are white. And that's inside the classroom, in the social areas and the cafeteria and parking lots, like everywhere at the university. So how race and racism are manifested on campus. So what does race look like? What does racism feel like? Also the presence and effects of intersecting oppressions. So when we talk about intersecting oppressions, we're talking about different minoritized or marginalized statuses and how they intersect to create a unique oppressive experience for people. So for instance, the experience and the feeling that, for instance, a Black woman might have at this university might be different than the experiences of a Black man. So these intersections look and feel different for people of different intersections. Effects of perceived discrimination. We wanted to understand how discrimination in the form of microaggression and also other types of discriminations, how they affect students psychologically, behaviorally, and in other ways, and how they deal with these perceived discriminations and oppressions. Okay, so our research methods. So first of all, we got our participants through emails to the campus and also to professors. We asked professors to ask their students, students of color, if they would participate in our study. We also sent around notices and flyers to different organizations that were um, made of students of minority status and especially students of color, and asked if they would participate. But most of our students we got through snowball sampling. So one participant decided to ask their friends or other people they knew who might be interested in participating. So that we ended up with about 25 participants in total. So we gathered our data through 9 focus group meetings. The average number of participants at each meeting was about 5 to 7. And we first had our participants answer a questionnaire where we gathered our demographics, and all this was self-identified. So we asked, how do you identify racially? How do you identify in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of sex, in terms of social class, and all of the demographics of interest? And so when we started each focus group, the question we asked and the way we gathered our data, we said, is race visible on campus? And that kind of started and guided the conversations among the participants. Okay, so what we're going to focus a lot on in our research and what we found as major themes in our research were microaggressions, and many of them were racialized, but then we also had microaggressions that were intersectional, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So microaggressions are a subtle form or not as obvious form of oppression. So micro meaning small, and aggression is some kind of attack. So Pierce was one of the first people to talk about microaggressions, and he defined microaggressions as subtle, automatic, and nonverbal. But later people say they're not necessarily nonverbal. They can be verbal, nonverbal, automatic, typically subconscious. Oftentimes the person who is aggressing doesn't even realize that they're being racist or sexist or whatever the type of oppression is. They're derogatory and commonplace everyday occurrences. Being everyday means that they happen so often that even sometimes the target of these types of oppression don't even, they're so used to it, they don't even realize that they're experiencing microaggressions. Bell says that for racist microaggressions, they typically convey a subconscious worldview of white supremacy and the inferiority of others. And this is something we'll also come back to. Some microaggressions seem complementary. Even the person who is aggressing, they mean to compliment the other person. They don't mean to be offensive, but what comes through is typically some sort of implied racism, like, you're pretty for a dark person. That person probably meant to be complimentary, but what's underlying that is that because they're dark, they're not expected to be pretty. And so it's obviously racist, but meant to be a compliment. And there are many effects of microaggressions, and we'll talk about some of the emotional, cognitive, social, academic effects of microaggressions. Some examples of microaggressions, these are not from our study, but they're just examples to help you understand. You're the whitest Black person I know. You don't act Black. Can I touch your hair? You're pretty in an exotic way. Those sorts of things are not really meant to be insults, but they are insults to the person who receives them. So some of the major findings and themes in our research, tons of microaggressions throughout the day. Academic and non-academic assumptions are underlying these microaggressions, and they have various effects. So one of the main things that that these students experience is a hypervisibility on campus. So like we said, we talked to students of color, so students who are not white, and they said that because of their minority status, being people who are in the numerical minority, they tend to stand out in what the students called a sea of whiteness at this school. So because most people around them are white, they feel like they just wanted to self-segregate so that they found other people who were not white. It wasn't necessarily that they found students who were of their particular race, but they wanted to self-segregate with other students of color because they felt like they might also feel marginalized at that school. So just kind of having that common minority status. So they self-segregated in the sea of whiteness. They felt that being in the minority, they felt extra visible which is interesting because most studies on experiences of students of color at white schools feel like they're invisible on campus, but our students said that they felt extra visible. So they felt like they stood out more than white students, that their behaviors were more noticed, that they were kind of under surveillance is what they reported, that they felt like they were being watched more. And they thought that was probably because of the stereotypes associated with being Black or brown, that the faculty and students there were kind of suspicious of them and watched them more. This is how the students perceive this. They also felt like because there were not many people of color at the school, that the whites around them expected them to be representatives of their race and saw them as representatives of their race. And so they felt like they had to be careful about what they said or what they did, because since there were not many people of color around, they didn't want to represent people in their group in a negative way. And they were worried they'd fulfill negative stereotypes. But they said that they thought white students got a lot of free passes, because if a white student wanted to, an example they gave was they were being loud in the cafeteria, then people wouldn't really think twice about it. These are just college students being college students. But if it's a group of Black students being loud, then
boys, it tends to look like them being perceived as more dangerous at early.
So if these were Black students being loud, then they thought that that this was because that this was attributed to their race. So it wasn't just that they were college students, that these Black kids are being loud, so that their race was why they were loud. And so they felt they were evaluated differently, and that their race was the reason for the evaluation. They also felt like they were being used as spoke tokens. Spoke tokenism means that the person is asked to speak on behalf of everyone in their race. And so some of the students said that their professors would even call on them to ask them how everybody of their particular group feels about something. One student, a Black student, said that she felt like, or she remembered that her professor asked her how all Black people feel about Black History Month. So asking you to speak on behalf of everybody in your group is what spoke tokenism is. And it essentializes the group. So that just means that it assumes that everybody of a group has something in common, an essence in common, where there's so much diversity within any group, but this disregards that, because obviously there's no group where everyone feels the same about everything, but that tends to be what people think. Thomasina's a 22-year-old Black female says, professors are more surprised if I don't know something specifically about Black people and Black culture. She gets that a lot. So another one of the themes we found was the importance or primacy of race, and that means that race seemed to be like the master status of these students on campus, or they felt like it was among all of the people most of the people they interacted with, and also in all of their relationships with people on campus. So they got, a lot of the times they got the question, what are you? And they said that was very dehumanizing. Also, just asking the question, what are you, means that that's the most important thing about them, is what they were. And of course, the person meant like, what race are you? But they've took a lot of offense to this. And let's see, Paulina, the 19-year-old biracial Mexican American, said the question, what are you? I get asked that probably at least once a week by somebody in my classes. At the beginning of the year when I moved in, people were afraid to ask me what I was. They were like going around the hall discussing with each other. And then I had somebody come up to me and be like, we've all been wondering what your ethnicity is. And she was like, what does this have to do with anything? She was very offended by this. And a lot of the participants felt the same way. Also, and along the same lines, there was the thought and the idea that a lot of the students felt like they weren't just a friend or a roommate or a student or whatever type of relationship they had with other people. They were a Black student or a Mexican roommate or a Native American friend. For instance, Darian said, my friend calls me his little Indian girlfriend, like he uses those words together all the time. And Darian said this guy wasn't even her boyfriend, and it was pretty demeaning that he called her little Indian girlfriend. He thought he was like being cool because his girlfriend was, or his friend, who he referred to as girlfriend, was a person of color. So it also, a lot of the times the students of color felt like people would be friends with them or hang out with them because it made them look cooler in some way. And a teacher actually told Alicia, she's a Black female, the teacher, when Alicia didn't go to class one day, the next time in class, the teacher said, "You're my only Black student in this class, so I have to keep up with you." Meaning that was obvious when the student was missing from class, but if any of the other white students were missing from class, the teacher barely noticed or didn't feel like she needed to keep up with that student. And Amber, she had all white roommates, and she said that they had lots of problems with her. They would argue and stuff pretty often, and she felt like their misunderstandings were because she was a Black girl. And she said, "Can y'all get to know me, Amber, not Amber the Black girl?" So their race was one of their primary ways that they were interacting with each other. Whereas whites don't have racial qualifiers. Whites are just students, just friends. It's not at this school, when the whites are in the majority, where they are in most universities and colleges, people don't typically qualify that person as a white student or a white friend, but for these students of color, their race became the major identity characteristic. Another major theme that we found was exotifying and alien and own land. So alien and own land is actually a type of microaggression by Sue et al. Sue is one of the major researchers on racial microaggressions, and Sue and his colleagues came up with a typology, like a classification system for microaggressions. And one they called alien and own land are the kind of microaggressions where the person the person lets the other person know that they're not seen as an average American, that they're an alien in the land that they were born in. So a lot of people who experience these are actually born in the US, but they are made to feel like they're not real Americans, that they're made to kind of prove their American status by these microaggressions. So for instance, Karen, she reported, she's a Dominican female. She said she often got the question, "Where are you really from?" And she's actually from North Carolina. And when she told people that, they were like, "No, where are you really from? You can't be from here." And it made her feel like she didn't belong here. And she said it's pretty offensive. And then especially among the students of color who were not Black, they would get misclassified as being Mexican pretty often, and they would be asked to speak Spanish. And if they said they were like Native American, for instance, they would say, "But you don't look Native American," just because people classified most of the other students, if they weren't Black, they classified them as Mexican. And also a major theme we also found were that the students of color were treated as objects, or their body parts were treated as objects. And also they were used for entertainment among white students. So at parties and things like that, and even in the classroom and on campus, some of the students said that they were told to dance for them, specifically twerking. So, and also like thinking that just because they were Black students, they would know how to twerk, and then using them for their own entertainment was also very offensive to these students. And if the students were thought to be Mexican or some type of ethnicity where they spoke Spanish, they would ask them to speak Spanish for them, thinking that just because they were not white or Black, they would know how to speak Spanish. And one that especially the Black women reported was that a lot of the white students, and especially the white females, wanted them to show them their hair or show them how they did their hair, or they wanted to touch their hair. And one of the Native American student in the study, she's Lumbee. She reported that a lot of the times people would joke on her or try to make fun of her her race as a Native American, and they'd talk about having powwows and doing rain dances and things like that. And she said it wasn't even funny. She was just so sick of it. It was so overdone, and people would just make fun of her all the time. And people, she said, weren't meaning to be like aggressive or rude to her or offensive, but she said it was just one of the main characteristics they thought of her was as a Lumbee or not a white student. So they always made fun of her or used her for their entertainment. And another game that people like to play among some of the participants was let us guess your ethnicity. So making a game out of guessing what these people's ethnicity was. And it was obviously pretty annoying for the people involved. So we talked about making these students objects or their body parts objects or exotic. And the major seen within this finding was that the Black students reported that their hair was a major characteristic that the white students would really like to play with or point at or touch or talk about. So Michaela, she's a Black Dominican female. She said, like, the white kids' biggest questions is like, oh my gosh, is that your hair? Or like, how is your hair like that? And so they'd always like to talk about the Black students' hair, but also one of the bigger complaints among these students was that the white students would like to touch their hair or play with their hair. So for instance, Karen, she's a white Black Dominican female. She reports people saying, can I touch your hair? What does your hair feel like? She said, usually when people meet me or when they don't even say a word to me and somebody's staring at me for a long time and then they just go grab my hair. And she said that happens a lot of the time. And she also said that her roommate asked her if she could watch her do her hair in the morning to see what she did to it. Another theme that's related to this is that the students, a lot of them were, frustrated because a lot of the students of color that they knew were actually internalizing this sort of hair issue, and that they would say things like, "Oh, you have good hair," or I have bad hair," or "I have," or you have, kind of compare what is good hair, what is bad hair, and even the students of color would say that they didn't have good hair because it didn't sort of imitate like Eurocentric type of hair. If it was like kinky or it was like curly, they would think it was bad hair. So they're internalizing this cultural standard of what good hair and bad hair is. Also, so our students, our participants reported a lot of intersectional types of oppression. So it's when two different types of oppressive statuses, two or more types, intersect in a way to create a particular experience for someone. So it's not enough to understand, like, let's say, for example, how racism works, because people don't experience just one type of oppression. You have to understand how they all interact and intersect to create someone's experience. Like gendered racism is one of the major types of oppression that we found in our research. People can experience sexism and racism in a particular way that would be different from someone else. And so we found that for example, the Black males experience a different type of oppression than the Black females in our study. So for the Black females, one of the major types of microaggressions that they experienced were the type of microaggressions that let them know that they were thought to be angry. And so the type of microaggression is called pathologization of communication style, where they're let to know by people's behaviors or the things that they say that they want them to calm down, or they're starting to become afraid of them if they get louder. So it's that angry Black woman stereotype that our culture has created and reinforced, that if a Black woman is at all elevated in her voice or her tone, then she's fulfilling that angry Black woman stereotype. So she's expected to be angry. And so the students talked a lot about this and how it was frustrating because they had to be careful not to fulfill it. Then for the guys, the Black and brown guys, they were expected to be like cool, to like hip hop music, or to have a certain way to communicate and interact with other people. Some of them said, it was mostly the Black guys who said that their white friends or suite mates would talk to them differently than they talk to their white friends. Like they would fist bump instead of shake hands, or they would have this different way of talking with them that was more like a stereotypical like hip hop way of talking. And the guys often thought this was kind of funny, but it also annoyed them. Then we have the more dangerous type of gendered racism, where we have Black and brown guys are criminalized by our society. And you can even see that in the interactions at this university. And I'll talk more about that soon, but it's sort of how these guys are made to know that other people are afraid of them, because our society often depicts them as dangerous and criminals. And so this even comes through in the interactions among these Black and brown guys at the dorms and basketball courts. They talked about it happening in the library and the cafeteria. So I'll talk about that soon. Also, another type of intersectional oppression would be the females, the Black and brown females were made to feel as if they were thought to be hypersexual and easy, as if they're some kind of fetish also. One student, Violeta, her family's from Spain, she's from the US, but she said when guys would want to date her, it would seem like they would want to date an exotic girl. And she's like, so it's not me, it's my ethnicity you want to date. And so just because they were not white, especially the students whose family were from other countries, they felt like they were just kind of like an exotic fetish. And some of the girls said that guys would come on them like really fast and expect them to be really easy because they're not white girls. The black guys, especially some of the brown guys, mostly the black guys, were thought to be predatory and dangerous sexually. They said that they heard from their friends that some of the girls were afraid to like dance with them or hang out with them at parties because they thought they'd try to be predatory towards them. And so they said their white friends didn't really face this kind of thing. There were some non-academic burdens of being black or brown at a white college. So kind of tying this together, the students really become their race instead of being college students or individuals for who they are, and their personality characteristics and things like that. They basically became their race, and people saw them through that lens of their race and those stereotypes and assumptions associated with their race. And they learned this because of the way that people treated them through verbal and behavioral microaggressions. They learned that people either feared them, thought they weren't capable, objectified them, exotified them. And so all of this made these students feel like they needed to spend extra cognitive and emotional energy trying to decide what to do about all of this, because microaggressions are really difficult to point out, especially because the person who is aggressing usually doesn't even know that they're aggressing. So to tell someone, to try to bring it up to someone and say, you're being sexist or racist or a combination or whatever the case is, it's really tricky because a person can get defensive, or they can deny it. So there are a lot of different considerations. So these students felt like they had to spend extra energy trying to decide if and how to avoid stereotypes embedded in microaggressions, or what to do about the microaggressions themselves. So some of the stereotypes, and we've talked about the angry Black woman stereotype that especially the Black females face so much, talking with their suite mates, talking with their professors, they often felt like these people were assuming they were angry when they were just trying to get a point across. So, and they didn't want to fulfill these stereotypes because they didn't want to give more evidence that the stereotype might be true. So they felt like they had to take extra care to appear calm. So if they felt like they were getting upset about something, they said, I need to calm down. I need to make sure not to come across as angry, even though if this were a white female, she could be angry and she could get louder because she's not viewed in terms of that stereotype. Even if they felt like they were being disrespected and warranted anger, they had to be careful not to become angry. So Keisha, a Black female, and she kind of explained the kind of thought behind this really well. I've been trying my hardest before I speak to think about how I'm going to speak to them. Mostly her white roommates is who she was talking about, and think about how I'm going to come across to them and try to be as nice as possible. How come I have to change the way I talk or present myself for you to feel more comfortable in our environment? So she explained that she has all white roommates, and in her own apartment, there are a lot of fights among the girls. And she said it's mostly the white girls. She tries to stay out of it. But when she does get involved, she feels like they evaluate her differently. They think she's angrier, whereas the other girls have been kind of arguing all along. But when she comes in, she's viewed in terms of that stereotype, and she tries to avoid that, even though it makes her upset that she has to kind of change how she comes across just so that those girls will feel more comfortable. A lot of the students also said that they know that there's that stereotype in our culture that Black and brown students don't care about class that much and they don't take academics seriously, and they're aware of this. And so they want to avoid fulfilling those stereotypes. And so there are different measures that they take. So they often will sit in front of the class, try not to talk to each other in class, take good notes, make the professor know that they're taking notes, like be obvious about it. They don't want to play on their phone while someone's looking. They feel like they just have more to prove than white students because they come in with these assumptions about them. And if they feel like if they slip once, they're going to just give more fuel to that stereotype, and they're going to feel like they're proving that stereotype. Something Keisha, the same student I quoted above, she said, there are 2 African-American people in one of my senior level classes, and it's me and another Black girl, and we text each other every day to make sure we're going to class, because since there's only 2 of us, neither one of us wants to be missing, or if we're both missing, we don't want that to be seen. And I don't think most white people think about that. So because there are only 2 Black females in their class, she knows that it would stick out even more if one of them was absent. And so in order to avoid fulfilling a stereotype that they're cutting class, they want to make sure at least one of them is there. So before class, they text each other to make sure one of them is coming, which is an extra step that a lot of white students don't even have to think about. Also, the stereotype that Black and brown students aren't as capable of white students are. They said that they want to avoid that, obviously, and so they have to be more careful about the words that they say and how they say them, articulate clearly when they're speaking with their professors and their advisors and other administrators. They have to study extra hard. They know that if they mess up once, if they get a bad grade, people might attribute that to their race and not to them as an individual. And they would say that if they think that if like a white student would get a bad grade on a test, well, that kid was having a bad day, or that individual just didn't study. But if a Black or brown student didn't do well, it's because that kid's Black or brown. And so they didn't want that to happen. So they just studied extra hard. So they felt like they had extra stressful experience in college in that way too. So there's also, I just talked about the criminalization of brown and Black males in our culture, which these guys felt happening on campus in various settings, in the dorms, campus grounds, the parking lot, even in the classroom. So this idea that Black and brown guys are dangerous, they're violent, they're criminals in some way. They knew this by the way some of the students said that their professors would follow them around as if they would cheat. So that's sort of being sneaky and pathological, or that they would try to steal things from other students. Students would watch their backpacks around them and move them away from them in the classroom or in the cafeterias, or at night, walking down the streets at night, the other students seemed to walk quickly by them or walk to the other side of the sidewalk. And they felt like these little microaggressions let them know that they're feared. Matt, 22-year-old Black athlete, he said, if I'm walking down the main street on campus or something, I try not to walk up on people or not to get too close to people because people really will freak out. I don't get it. So he's saying that he has to monitor the way he walks home so that he doesn't scare other people. He also said he likes to make sure his backpack is visible so that people know he's a student and he's not just some person coming onto campus. So that makes people feel a little bit more comfortable. So the idea is that these people have to change their behaviors and put a lot more thought into just how they kind of maneuver on campus, interact with people, just to make other people comfortable and so that they don't fulfill stereotypes. Kyle, Black and Puerto Rican athlete, says, when you're walking on campus or something and you open a door, usually like white people say sorry for no reason. You're like if you're waiting in line and turn back around, they'll say sorry, but I'm like, what are you sorry for? They say sorry, like I'm going to push them out of my way and like choke them or snap their neck because I'm this Black guy. And this is what a lot of the guys would say happening, that they noticed a lot of white students or faculty would apologize for no reason if they would bump into them or get close to them, just apologizing. They weren't sure what that was all about. Maybe they thought they were going to get upset or they weren't really sure, but they noticed it basically in every setting. Also in small spaces, they sensed fear from other people, especially in the elevator. This happened. Multiple students of the guys reported this, that some people were fearful of letting them on the elevator with them, or if they were on the elevator and one of these Black or brown guys walked onto the elevator, the other person would move to the other side of the elevator, or maybe shuffle their bag around so that the guy wasn't too close to their belongings, or they would even say that they needed to announce themselves when coming home to the dorm or the apartment. So especially the Black guys would say that when they came home, they would come inside the room or the living room, the living area, and say, hey, this is Mike, I'm home, or so that the person won't be fearful of just some Black or brown guy coming into their house. So this is just something that a lot of white people don't have to think about, just being careful about basically everything. Conclusion, overarching themes that we found throughout. So racialized identities of these students were racialized. Their race became the primary characteristic of how other people saw them and how they were identified in other people's eyes. And it was an essentialized identity. So it was this identity built upon cultural assumptions of what their group is like, and it was imposed upon them. And so they had to take measures to fight against these stereotypes. Every aspect of life, this happened in dorms, this happened in the classroom, it happened everywhere. And Amber, a Black female, said, I just want to be a college student, but they see me as a Black college student, and that matters. She said it really does matter to her and other students that they're seen as their race first instead of the reason that they're in college as a student. So they experience daily experiences and cumulative. So these experiences accumulate to create a whole different college experience for these students because of their race and other intersecting characteristics. So there's not just one college life. When people talk about what is college like or what is college life like, there are many different experiences in college, and this is affected by your race and other characteristics that intersect with your race to affect how people see you and how they treat you. And then how people treat you affects how you see society and how you see your experiences. And so there are many different college life experiences. These students experience unnoticed social, cognitive, emotional, academic, and psychological burdens, and it also affects their self-esteem. And so these students are walking around campus with many different considerations going through their minds, like how should they walk, how should they talk in different settings. I got to make sure I study hard. I don't want to fulfill this stereotype or that stereotype. All these things that white students really don't think about in white settings. And that really does affect them. It's kind of like an extra burden, emotional and cognitive burden that's distracting from what they're there for in the first place. And they say it really does affect their self-esteem too, that they have all these negative stereotypes imposed on them. And their academic identity is overshadowed and minimized by their race. And all of the students said that they really want to expose all of this stuff, but they weren't sure how. They wanted people to be aware because they felt like a lot of people just weren't aware of their experiences and also the contributions to these experiences, like their professors. They said they don't think their professors were intentionally being offensive or hurtful or marginalizing them, but they want them to be aware so that they can stop doing this. They thought that they would actually appreciate it if they could figure out the right way to make people aware, to expose what's going on. But it's kind of tricky to know how to do that. So dealing with microaggressions is difficult, and that's one of the reasons why they're so effective in reinforcing racism and all the other types of oppression, because they're hidden and they're not really obvious. So students have to think, or people in general have to think, was that behavior or was that thing that person said because I'm Hispanic or because I'm a woman or because I'm gay or whatever? Was that because of this category that I belong to? Did that just happen? Did anybody else notice that? Should I just laugh? Like, what should I do about that? Should I blow it off? Was that because I'm a Black guy? Is it worth getting my blood pressure up about? So when people experience a microaggression, because it's not obvious and because it's like easily dismissed, all these things can go through your mind. And so what if I do respond? But what if I don't respond? So if I respond, will I reinforce a stereotype? Will they think I'm too sensitive or playing the race card? Will it even make a difference if I respond? Will I become more upset? Or will I feel better if I speak up? Will I be in danger if I speak up? Some of these students reported feeling that they felt like in some cases, if they did point out the oppression that they're experiencing, then they might actually be in physical harm. And they said that one thing that made it easier to speak up is if other people were around, and if these were people who they knew would have their back and who understood what they were going through. But if they were alone, they were less likely to speak up. And these students all kind of had the question, why are some people so resistant to acknowledging racism and other oppressions? And something that they came to the conclusion themselves just by talking to each other. They think that even if someone deep down recognizes their contribution to racism or sexism or heterosexism or whatever we're talking about, they felt like that acknowledging that would make them feel guilty and would also make them have to acknowledge that they have a particular privilege in the world by not being oppressed in this way. And so many people don't realize that they are being offensive, but even if they do, they really don't want to give that up. So we just talked about some of the psychological, emotional, behavioral considerations and effects of microaggressions that these students experienced. But these are pretty similar for people, just the general population in society. So research shows that brown and Black people experience perceived discrimination and racism daily. And that doesn't only go for Black and brown people, but also any type of minoritized group. So women, minority sexual orientation groups, immigrants, people not born in this country. So basically any type of minority group experiences perceived discrimination. So these can have pretty harsh effects on a person, even physically. So anxiety, depression, stress is a big deal. And I'm a social epidemiologist, and I do a lot of work on racial disparities and different chronic diseases. So there's evidence that stress associated with even perceived discrimination can lead to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and even cancer. So a lot of this is through the stress pathway. So when people are stressed out, their fight or flight mechanisms go into action. So this is when the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis are activated. And when this happens, and often and chronically, a person is always in the fight or flight mode. So their body's always on guard, and cortisol increases and different things to the that are supposed to be helpful. But if they don't decrease or go back to homeostasis, then this puts the body in danger health-wise. So these are linked with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So microaggressions are a big part of this and can be very dangerous because they're pretty chronic and everyday occurrences. So we talked about these processes in the education system at a university, but they aren't unique to institutions of education. These processes, as we know, occur in most of the institutions in our society. So the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, political system, military. So in most of the major institutions, people are discriminated against and perceived as in minority categories every day through microaggressions and other types of racist or whatever type of aggression it is, acts. And it's pretty dangerous and harmful. So we feel like there's a lot to be done here. And it's also not just institutions, it's like in the grocery store or pumping gas on the streets, anywhere people experience microaggressions. Yeah. Okay. So, so thanks. That's the end of our presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
If y'all have any questions, we can take them now, or you can email us. We have our emails are up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reiter and Dr. Reiter.
Thank you, Scott.
I really appreciated sort of learning. You surfaced a lot of what our students might be experiencing.
Mhm.
And I think it's important for us as faculty to be very mindful and intentional and implement those strategies that you suggested. So thank you for being with us here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Abby and